Hey everyone, my name's Corel, and today we're going to be doing another From the Depths tutorial, this time on AI configuration. This is a pretty big topic, so we're going to go ahead and dig right on in with our components first. Starting off with the AI, we have the mainframe. This is the most expensive block and also the most important block of your AI system. This controls all of your other AI systems. It's what dictates your movement, your weapon controls, everything else boils down to and has to be connected to this one block. So make sure you connect this well. Next up, we've got our connectors here. The connectors are essentially just a way of extending the number of attachment points like you've seen in other systems. I can just attach those to a mainframe here, and they extend the area that I can connect to. We've had the PIDs here. I've done a tutorial on these before. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. These PIDs are used for balancing thrusters and that sort of thing, and generally you won't need any more than 6 connected to an AI in order to control all 3 translational and rotational axes of movement. Next up, we've got the wireless transmitters here. The wireless transmitter, this is a little bit of an interesting one because a wireless transmitter is necessary on the mainframe side of any sort of wireless bridge, but not on the remote side. So if I was to try and create a remote system over here, let's just put some connectors down over here on the sides as an example. These are not connected right now. If I take a wireless transmitter, and it has to be the transmitter on the mainframe connection, and I attach that to the mainframe, and I put a receiver out here, then these are now connected. It's worth noting that you have multiple channels available to you. This is very useful when you start talking about ACB logic and other mechanisms of control, but more or less what you can do is you can look at these and hit Q in order to change what channel they're transmitting on. So in this case I've got 5 different channels. I can pick which one of these channels I'm going to send and receive messages on, and really as long as I'm set to the same channel, I'll be able to get messages from that channel. So if I was to connect these on channel 2, they are no longer connected because, well, that one over on the left is no longer connected because I'm transmitting on channel 1. That is interesting in that I can, over here on this other AI that I had pre-built on this machine, I can set up another transmitter, tell that to transmit on channel 2, and I can actually get a different wirelessly connected system running off a different AI. That can be useful in some circumstances. So for now I'm going to set this back to channel 1, and we'll go on and take a look at our next set of components. We have cards. So these are back up here in the AI card slots. Generally, with card slots, you're going to need to connect these in an area that gives you space on the left and right to add cards to these card slots, or up and down if you place them horizontally. And you want probably no fewer than 2 of these, and probably no more than 3. That's really all that I think you're going to find necessary in the vast majority of cases. So the card slots let you use pre-configured cards. We'll go into those in a minute, but those let you predefine a bunch of AI behaviors and get those up and running quickly without needing to mess around a whole lot with fiddly little settings. However, mostly what you want in these card slots is these 3 cards. Interestingly, the general purpose processing card, even though it says it's a card, does not have to be connected to card slots. It can be connected to connectors. If I take this thing and I plop it down here, these are connected. So looking at the cards, we've got first target prioritization. Target prioritization, and let's get the mirror line off because I only need 1 each of these. Target prioritization allows me to dictate, based on a bunch of different parameters, how important a target is. So a positive value is going to make a target more important per that thing, and a negative value is going to make it less important. So in this case, the default settings make it more important for every block it has, for every weapon it has, for every crew or player it has, or AI block I think is the clipped off text down there. It has more importance per propulsion unit it has, more value per engine, higher ranking for speed and altitude, and way less per range. So this is trying to prioritize all of these things in different amounts and deprioritize range, so it will try and not target things as far away. So that's what these are for, and you can customize those to your own needs. Generally what I like to do is, if I'm using missiles or something that doesn't particularly care about range as long as it's within its range gate, then I will set range to 0 or something along those lines. If I've got a laser-equipped vehicle, I want to boost the value per speed all the way up, because lasers don't care about your silly speed nonsense. And so I want my laser-equipped vehicles to be hunting down those really fast jets flying around that my cannon and missile-equipped vehicles are going to have more trouble with. So those are a few ideas. You can obviously set these up in an infinite number of combinations. You just want to set it up so that these are going to be targeting things the way you want. Now there is a nice way you can debug that. If I spawn a Marauder in here and quickly turn off its ability to fire. Okay, so now if I take a look at this, I have a Marauder, and that is ranked up here. If I was to spawn in also a Kalmar, let's say, and let's go ahead and also turn its ability to fire off, I can now see that the Kalmar is prioritized over the Marauder, and that's because of the range to the vehicle, along with its size and the weapons on it, and all of those other prioritization factors that we've already set up. The next card is the aim point selection. I always want one of these on every vehicle that I'm creating if it has accurate weapons. If you're just sandblasting an enemy with a ton of tiny little projectiles, aim point selection might not be for you. If you're not really firing those accurately, aim point selection isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. But what this does is it will allow you to try and target specific blocks. Now, I can configure this to try and target blocks above water or not. I can configure it to target random blocks, and in fact it looks like there used to be another option here. I think this might be a bug in this current patch, but you used to be able to target AI and ammo blocks specifically with aim point selection. So now we've only got this target random blocks option, which isn't what I'm aiming for. But in this case, normally there will be some options here that you can pick from. You can set a max time before changing targeted blocks, so if you cannot destroy the block that you're targeting within a specific time frame, this will force the AI to change targets. That can be quite useful so that your vehicle doesn't get fixated on something it can never hit. Alright, so those are those two cards. We've also got behaviors and additional routines. And I haven't gotten into what exactly behaviors and these routines and stuff are, but for now, know that this card allows your mainframe to access more of them when you start configuring it. If you go over to the pre-configured cards, it will allow you to access more of these types of behaviors at one time. That can be useful in specific circumstances. So speaking of pre-configured cards, we're actually going to leave those off just a little bit for now, and we're going to move on to configuring an AI and get that out of the way before I show you what the pre-configured cards do exactly. Alright, so looking at our vehicle here, I've opened up the AI here by hitting Q on any of these physical connectors connected to the AI mainframe, and that's just going to open this vehicle AI customization window. This has a lot of stuff going on here. We're going to try and move through this fairly quickly, so I might not explain every little detail, but the text explains fairly well what each thing is for. There's just a few little gotchas and things that I'd like to describe along the way. So the first thing to look at here is the Behaviors tab. Behaviors are the way your vehicle behaves. Quite simply, they are the thing that your vehicle is going to try and do, how it's going to maneuver, or rather where it's going to maneuver and why. So behaviors are more or less what you're going to try and do. Adjustments give you a few tweaks in the way in which your vehicle decides how to get to those points. Maneuvers give you a physical, how do I accomplish the behavior that I'm wanting to set up. So if I have a behavior that says what I want to do, the maneuver is how I want to do it in terms of what thrust components do I have, what movement methods do I have, all that sort of thing. Additional gives me a few additional tweaks that I can make. They can give me like the ability to dodge projectiles and that sort of thing using my thrust. PIDs we've already taken a look at in the last tutorial. these are how I define my movement systems. And then we've got basic settings over here. For the most part, the only thing I use out of this is the mainframe name. I don't feel a lot of need to use anything else out of this system, simply because the rest of the configuration options are, for the most part, counterproductive once you've set up your thrusters the way you want. Clicking these buttons will actually unset settings that you've set on your thrusters, so I tend not to like to do that a whole lot. But naming your AI mainframe can be useful. If you hit C here, you can see that both of these mainframes that I have on this vehicle are unnamed, not particularly useful, so I tend to like to name these somewhat. Or at least if I've got multiple AIs on a vehicle, I'll name them differently from each other so I'm not getting a whole lot of duplicates. Now, these cards are basically AI behaviors and maneuvers in one package. If I hit Q on anything connected to my AI, behaviors and maneuvers combine to dictate how your vehicle moves in the vast majority of cases, though there are a couple of things that can help override those behaviors as well. But for the most part, just assume that these pre-configured cards are going to set your behavior, they're going to set your maneuver, and together those things are going to control how your vehicle moves. So each of these has a different specialty. We've got the frontal hovercraft AI. These are going to keep at a set distance from an enemy and point at it. We've got a bombing run hovercraft, where it's a hovercraft that's going to fly around not like a jet, but like a six-axis controlled vehicle. And those are going to run past and do bombing runs. And we've got a regular bombing run AI that's going to be more jet-style control, where we use forward thrust and assume that we have wings generating lift and that we're using the nose to control the yaw, all that sort of thing. We've got a circling hovercraft AI, where we have a hovercraft or a six-axis vehicle where you've got control authority on all six axes, and this is going to circle around the enemy at a set distance. We've got a circling airplane AI that's going to circle the enemy at a given distance, again using the same jet-style movement as the bombing run airplane AI. And we've got a circling ship AI and a circling tank AI. Obviously these are for ships and tanks respectively. Alright, so those are our pre-configured behavior cards. In order to place one of these, you just grab one and put it next to one of these card slots. It does have to be connected to a card slot. It can't be down here, so you do want it on that card slot. Alright, so I've removed the other AI so we don't have any conflicts here. Now we've got this single AI here, we've got a few card slots on it and our PIDs that are already tuned for us, so let's just go ahead and jump right into these behaviors. And let's see what we've got the options for here. So first thing to note, a bunch of the behaviors towards the bottom are duplicates of things that are at the top. In specific, the aerial bombing is very similar to add bombing run. So the aerial bombing is the old From the Depths aerial AI before they came up with a new AI system, and its behaviors are often a little wonky, so I tend to prefer just using the regular bombing run. Similar with the naval and the tank broadside, I tend to prefer the regular broadside, though tank broadside does have some use in tanks specifically. So let's start walking through these and see exactly what these are for. First off, we have the add bombing run. This is a standard bombing run behavior. This will try and fly over a target and drop bombs, and then it can also have the option to break off below a minimum range. Now if you're thinking about dropping missiles, those can fly forwards based on the velocity of your vehicle. They inherit that velocity when you release them. So if I've got a bomb that's flying forwards, I can afford to break off a few hundred meters away from a target, and that way I'm not exposing myself by flying directly over the target. I can get a nice evasive movement pattern by rotating or turning in some form or fashion and getting out of dodge before the enemy can bring their guns to bear. So this is very useful, and I tend to like this particular setting whenever I'm creating a bomber. This will basically just charge the enemy, get within the break-off range, and then try and retreat. It will retreat to the re-engage distance or for the re-engage time, whichever happens first, and then it will re-engage. It will turn to face the target and try and fly in again. So this is going to this first setting up here is interesting. It will let you pitch to the target below a specific distance. Now what this means is when I get within 800 meters of this target, I'm going to pitch or nose down so that I'm aiming straight at them. Sometimes this is good. It means that your bombs don't have to travel as far and will get a greater velocity directly towards your target, but they will have less range because you're giving them initial downwards velocity. Because you're pitching your nose downwards, you're going to travel downwards with a jet style of movement, presumably. So this pitch will effectively mean that you are aiming your bombs directly at the target. Now, if you think about an unpowered bomb, that bomb is going to start dropping and gain negative lift velocity, if that makes sense. It will start traveling downwards faster if you have your nose pitched down. So that's something to consider. This might be more useful if your bomber is using guns or fixed-mounted forward mount guns or missiles that have thrusters on them, anything along those lines. So pitch to target distance can be useful in a number of scenarios, but it's not always what you want. Now, combat altitude is going to be the altitude that you try and maintain while you're in combat, and that's useful in, well, determining how high your bomber is going to fly. And you can set that to be relative to sea level, relative to the target. So if you're firing at, say, aiming rather, at, say, a jet that's flying at 200 meters and my combat altitude is 200 meters, this is going to try and bring me all the way up to 400 meters. Or I could say ignore altitude, and that's going to ignore altitude. That means that this setting is not used at all, and I, in the adjustments tab, have some altitude clamping that I can do, and that will set a minimum and maximum altitude, and it's basically going to be up to these settings rather than the combat altitude to try and maintain any sort of altitude. Now, another important thing in this UI, right now I have this bombing run behavior created. I do not have it engaged. I need to actually click on this in order to activate it. If you don't do that, it's not going to be active, and you're going to be very confused when you go and try and make the vehicle do something and it's just not doing anything. Yeah, you want to click on this and activate it. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and we'll move on to the next one. The next one is circle, and this behavior lets you maintain a specific distance from an enemy. You've got this combat distance here. We'll try and maintain that distance as best we can, and we'll try and maintain this altitude as best we can. Again, we have the same altitude settings over here that we had before. That's useful. And we've got a minimum approach angle. So if we're approaching enemies, we're always going to point at least 45 degrees away from pointing straight at them. This is a very defensive behavior because we're going to try and circle around a target without ever trying to approach them directly. So if we have forward fixed mount things, fixed mount weaponry, this is not going to be useful because those guns are never going to be brought to bear. Missiles can turn and pick up a target that way. Lasers, you might be able to use optics to steer, though at that high of an angle it's debatable. But for the most part, you're going to want to use turrets when you start dealing with a circle at a distance AI. Okay, so the next thing is the max roll to target. And this is a really interesting thing, these two settings here. So the roll to target, I'm actually going to talk about the second setting first. What this lets us do is say, if I am within 15 degrees of the direction that I want to point, so if I am within 15 degrees of, say, my left wingtip pointing straight at the target on a circling jet, then I want to roll to point my wingtip exactly at the target. Now that includes the pitch of the wingtip, or my actual roll. And so what this is letting me do is aim a turret on the top of the vehicle directly at the target. That's super useful for laser vehicles because they don't have any sort of arc of fire. Without this setting, you're basically never going to be able to point a flying jet at a sea target. It's just not going to happen. If you are flying and circling around it and it's completely stationary and your laser is on top of your vehicle and you're flying at 300 meters at 1,000 meters out, you would need to be able to aim nearly, what is that, 33.3 degrees down in order to hit that target. And yeah, it's not going to work real well. Well, yeah, that would be a 30 degrees down angle roughly. And you're not really going to be able to reach that angle. It's just not going to work out for you. You could try and counter that with steering optics on the laser, but then you're reducing your damage via the laser mechanics. So really what you want is to pitch your wingtip down so that you can aim that turret directly at the target. These two settings help you accomplish that. So another interesting thing of note here is these upwards and downwards evasion altitude offsets and evasion within azimuth. As with the roll, the evasion within azimuth determines when we are allowed to start evading. So only if my wingtip is within 10 degrees of pointing straight at the target will I start evading in this way. So I'm not wasting control authority attempting to evade while I'm still trying to get myself oriented correctly relative to the target. Now the upwards evasion altitude offset and downwards evasion altitude offset basically mean that within my combat altitude I can evade, let's say if I set this to 20, I can evade 20 meters upwards from that combat altitude. And if I go 20 meters down here, I can evade 20 meters downwards from this combat altitude. So basically this is letting me, within that 90 degrees to the target angle, within 10 degrees of that angle, I'm allowing myself to vary the altitude 20 degrees upwards and downwards, and it will just continuously waver back and forth between these two offsets. When it reaches one, it'll go towards the other. When it reaches the other, it'll go back towards the one. And what that means is that cannons and other projectiles that take a long time to reach me are likely not going to be able to hit me very effectively because they're going to have been aiming at my current velocity at the time that they fired. They're going to be trying to predict my current movement based on my current angle and my current flight pattern, and then I'm going to keep changing that periodically and quickly. So they're going to have a very difficult time hitting that vehicle reliably. The last setting down here is use both sides. I can set this to use one specific side of my vehicle, so I can build a sideways vehicle that has all the guns mounted on the left side, all the other stuff mounted on the right side, and I can actually fly that and make sure that my left side is what I'm using to point towards the target. Very useful. Even for ships, I would generally recommend circle at a distance as a very useful tool, though you probably do want to not use the roll and evasion offsets with a ship. Just saying. Also, combat altitude should probably be 0. Anyway, so that is circle at a distance, and we'll move on next to point at. Now, point at is, again, a new style of AI. This is going to point at the target. That's really all there is to it. It's not going to do a whole lot for you other than point at the target, but it will point at that target very well. And it also has some nice evasion settings. So, again, we have combat distance and altitude. That's what we try and maintain as far as distance, what altitude we try and maintain. We get the max pitch to target. This, when it's pointing at something, will point directly at that thing. That includes aiming the nose downwards to point straight at the target. Max pitch to target determines the maximum pitch that you're going to allow for that, because generally aiming your pitch off of perfectly flat or 0 degrees is going to mean that you end up using control authority to counter movement that you get in the forwards-backwards direction as you're trying to maintain a steady hover. So we've also got a setting to disable pitch above a certain azimuth to the target. Again, if we're 15 degrees away from pointing straight at the target, we're not going to try and pitch towards the target. Again, we want to save that control authority to maneuver so that we can get to point at the target sooner, and then we can pitch down towards it. This is a fine adjustment. It's something that you want to do after you're already roughly pointing towards the target. Same with the left and right evasion. We've got this disable evasion. That works exactly the same way. I'm going to not try and evade if I'm pointing more than 15 degrees away from the target. Now, left and right evasion time, this is very similar to the altitude evasion times, or meter sizes rather, that I adjusted in the previous AI. This is going to allow me to evade left for 1 second, right for 1 second. If I wanted to always circle in a leftwards direction, I could set that to 0 and I could evade left 1 second, then right for 0 seconds, then left for 1 second, then right for 0 seconds. So this would effectively always have me sliding left around the target. Likewise, I could do the same thing on the right side. I could slide more right than left, but still use the evasion. There's all sorts of nasty tricks I can pull with this. The upshot of it is I'm always going to be changing my left and right slide or strafe controls, so I'm not going to be maintaining a constant velocity. In terms of evading fire and from the depths, the worst thing you can possibly do is maintain a constant, predictable velocity. If your velocity is always changing, that is your angle of movement, your direction of movement, if that is always changing, guns are going to have a terrible time tracking you. And a lot of missiles will too, unless they have tracking assistance on them. So you want to always be modifying your velocity somehow, and both the point at and maintain distance and the circling AI give you the tools to do that. So broadside is very similar to the point, or the circle behavior, but it's going to allow you to adjust the angle you want to maintain. So if you've got a naval vehicle, not all of those can bring their guns a full 90 degrees to point straight sideways, and you might have weaker guns on the back of the deck than you do on the front, so you might want to maintain, say, a 75 degree angle, and that would allow you to bring your frontal guns to bear. You might be able to bring some of the back ones to bear too, depending on how far they can rotate, but you're more likely going to be able to keep those front guns firing more. And then you've got a minimum and maximum distance. I can say I want to be, say, between 800 and 1,000 meters away from the target. And it's going to try and maintain this angle while it's within this minimum and maximum distance. If it goes below the minimum distance, it's going to turn away. If it goes above the minimum distance, it's going to turn towards the target, just to try and get within those parameters. So that's broadside. We've also got a ramming behavior. This is effectively a way of charging straight at the enemy and using melee weapons. This is the bring me closer that I may hit them with my sword type of deal. This will let you disengage below a certain distance if you want to, but really we're talking about melee weapons. Why would you disengage? No, stop it. Don't even think about that. No, go all in, go full forwards, ram that sucker, just go nose in first. Just take the vehicle and ram it right into your target, and you're going to do a lot more damage than if you try and use this to disengage. So I tend to disengage below a certain distance, and I tend to set that to 0, because most of the time I'm not wanting to disengage. Most of my vehicles are usually pretty maneuverable when I try and make melee type vehicles, so I like to set the disengage to 0. Now what it's for, it's not going to just automatically disengage you within that range. So what this is going to do, if I am within, say, 25 meters, I think that's the default, when I am below 25 meters and I start getting further away from the target, that is, when I start getting at least 5 meters further away from the target than I have ever been during this engagement. So like if I get within 15 meters and then suddenly I find myself at 20 meters, then I'm going to disengage, I'm going to try and get some distance, I'm going to turn around, and then I'm going to come back in for another ram. That can be useful. So disengage below 25. I don't always set this to 0, but most of my vehicles are maneuverable enough that I don't feel the need to use this. Generally, if you're making a ramming vehicle, you want it to be far more maneuverable in its target to begin with. So I tend to not like this a whole lot. In any case, you also have an engage above distance. That means that you get at least this far away before you engage a charge. Now what that lets you do is say, I have 100 meter turning radius. That's awful for a ramming vehicle, but let's just go with it for now. Say if I have a 100 meter turning radius, then it's going to take me 200 meters to turn around. Then I get aimed back at the vehicle, sure, but it's going to take me some distance to do that. And this engage above lets me ensure that I have the distance necessary to make that turn before I begin the turn. Now, there's also a disable adjuster. So there's this adjustments tab over here, and this has a bunch of different pathfinding options in it. You generally want to disable these below a certain distance. and this gives you a lot of distance to work with. I tend to use fairly low distance, but what this will do is tell your pathfinding, hey, maybe I actually don't want to avoid hitting enemy vehicles. If I want to evade an enemy vehicle and I'm using a ramming behavior, this does not compute. This is not what you want. So I want to disable those adjustments below 50 meters, say, and that will make sure that I'm not trying to use the adjustments to pathfind around an enemy vehicle. So the next one to look at is the naval behavior. Now this is the old From the Depths AI behavior, and I don't like this. I think the newer behaviors, I think the broadside and circle behaviors encompass a nicer feature set and are more reliable than the old naval behavior. So I'm not really going to go over this too much. Just assume that if you are running naval behavior, probably what you want is these days is broadside or circle, one of the two. Naval has some quirks with it that I don't like dealing with. The tank broadside, however, is very much like the naval behavior, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this, and hopefully that'll let you know what the naval behavior does. So tank broadside behavior lets you enter a broadside below a specific range. Now that broadside is going to mean a bunch of different things. What that usually means is I want to approach to this angle, or I want to keep my nose this angle away from the target. So if I set this to 90, then I would have a 90-degree angle from my nose to the target, which means my side is pointing at them. Note that there are no settings here for which side. You have to set that to -90 in order to actually, well, in fact, this doesn't even allow for it. You need to set that to 90 in order to have a 90-degree angle, and you cannot control which side is pointed at the target. The other thing we've got here is a broadside minimum range, so if I'm, say, I can enter a broadside below 1,000 meters, let's say I want to leave it if I'm below 800, and that will keep me below 800 to, or between 800 and 1,000 meters away from the target, and if I'm below that, I'm going to try and increase range, and if I'm, well, I have this leave broadside above, and I could set this to 1,200, say, and then I'm going to try and enter broadside below 1,000. So this is going to say, whenever I get below 1,000 meters, I want to start broadsiding. If I get below 800, I'm going to leave that broadside. If I get above 1,200, I'm going to leave that. So there's a little bit of hysteresis there. That's a term for basically slop. Once I enter that broadside, I've got some sloppiness that I can allow for in the upwards and downwards direction before I leave the broadside. And those are really the majority of what the naval AI settings are. The tank broadside adds these idle settings. Now what these do is allow me to cease movement below a specific range. So I can say if I'm within 500 meters of the target, I just want to stop dead. And for tanks, that's nice because you're no longer dealing with the ups and downs of terrain, you're no longer dealing with the bumpy movement there. So this lets me stop moving and get a stable firing platform at the cost of making myself a lot easier to hit. So that's what this tank AI is going to do for me. The idle approach distance, more or less these old From the Depths AIs will try and approach within a set distance of the player whenever they're not actively fighting an enemy. So this is just going to be used to make sure that the vehicle sticks somewhat close to the player. Really not terribly useful in most circumstances, unless you're in the campaign. Alright, so we've also got aerial bombing. This has been almost entirely superseded by bombing run. I see absolutely no reason to use this. I'll show you the settings here, but yeah, you can pretty much figure these out. They're very self-explanatory. I would not ever use that. I would just use the bombing run. That is the old aerial AI from the Depths, and it's pretty much just flat inferior to bombing run in every respect. You've also got resource gathering. This is most commonly used on fortresses, but can be used on other types of vehicles, especially if you're adding multiple behaviors to a vehicle. And what resource gathering does is exactly what it says on the tin. It's going to drive to the closest resource zone and sit right in the middle of it so that you can fire off your resource harvesters. That's pretty much it. If I've got, say, this vehicle flying around, and I want it to fly up to a resource zone or be able to fly into a resource zone and stay in the middle of it, then having this around might be useful. Now, you'll note here that if I have this in here, I have this capacity full. Now, capacity full means that I don't have enough storage capacity for all of the behaviors and additional routines that I want. Note that this is not necessary for adjustments or maneuvers, just behaviors and additional routines. But what I want here is to take a behaviors and additional routines card and stick that in there, and now I can add some other behaviors. So now I've got an additional slot I can use. I can add, say, a bombing run behavior, and I can say activate this, and whenever I'm done with my bombing runs in the campaign and I want to go grab some resources, I can say let's go get some resource gathering on, and this will do that for me. That's just fine. So I can just manually switch this. I can also switch this with ACBs, which are a thing I haven't talked about a whole lot yet, but we'll be getting into in a later tutorial. Alright, so that's pretty much all of the behaviors. Let's go ahead and start digging into the other tabs. Now remember, adjustments are slight adjustments to the pathfinding that's defined in behaviors. Behaviors are the overall path that we're going to try and take. Adjustments give us a little bit of direction into how to accomplish those without running into certain very negative events, like colliding with terrain, colliding with other vehicles, or flying into space, or for a submarine maybe sinking too far down below the water, or surfacing for that matter. So for this adjustments tab, you have the select vehicle type. That is going to be in air, on water, or on land. Unset will basically try and figure out what you're trying to do with this vehicle based on the behaviors and maneuvers, and it's usually pretty good at figuring out what you want. Often I don't find myself having to set this, the game just kind of figures it out for me. So the next thing here is collision avoidance. Now collision avoidance is great. You want this all the time, everywhere, on everything. The only time I would turn this off, well, basically never. With the ramming behavior being able to turn off adjustments below a specific distance, then there's really not a whole lot of need for turning collision avoidance completely off. I would at least keep it on avoid friendly vehicles. Altitude clamping is a little bit different depending on each type of vehicle type. So each of these water, land, and air altitudes, or vehicle types rather, is going to give me a different type of altitude clamping. But for the most part, what I'm doing here is setting minimum altitude above land, above water, and above, well, maximum altitude above sea level rather. So these are going to give me a set of controls that allow me to say I'm not ever going to go above or below a specific altitude relative to the surface of the water or the surface of the land. Whether that surface of the land is above or below the water doesn't matter as far as the altitude above land respects go. The only other thing here is the extra options. This gives us the ability to predict terrain height up to 10 seconds into the future. So when we're talking about pathfinding on water or land, we need to look ahead at the terrain in order to stay on land if we're driving a tank, or stay in the water if we're driving a boat or a submarine. And the terrain height prediction is going to attempt to take our vehicle's current maneuvering and determine where we will be in the future, and more or less just say, 10 seconds into the future, am I going to run into terrain? If I am, I don't want to be there. Let's try and pathfind around it. So yeah, this is very useful in making sure that your surface vehicles or your submarine vehicles don't run into terrain. That's usually a bad thing. It incurs a lot of damage on the vehicle, so you want to avoid that, and this lets you do it on any type of vehicle. Next tab is maneuvers. Now maneuvers are the other really big thing. Behaviors and maneuvers combined dictate the entirety of how your vehicle moves for the most part, barring the tiny bits of time where adjustments or additional routines kick in and do something for you. So maneuvers are very important. You want to learn these well. So first off, we have airplane movement. And you note that as soon as I add this, I can activate it here like the others, just to make sure that this is the active one. As soon as I activated that, I'm starting to get controls. So right now I am trying to maneuver. And I'm trying to maneuver right into the ocean, apparently. Let's see. Oh, yeah, let's do a bombing run instead of maneuvering into a resource zone, shall we? So this is going to try and actually use the thrusters to accomplish the behavior that we already have set. So I have that bombing run behavior set. This is going to try and use these thrusters, and it's going to try and make me behave like an airplane. Obviously, this is not an airplane, but it's going to make me behave a lot like one. So these maneuvers all have a various set of controls that they will actually use. Alright, so we've got this airplane movement maneuver, and let's just go ahead and dig right on into its various settings here. We've got a maximum pitch for altitude control, so if I'm too high or too low, I can actually set this to be able to use pitch to help control the altitude. So if I set this to, say, 15 degrees up, and that will let me use 15 degrees of nose up and down to maintain altitude. In this case, I don't need that because I've got the thrusters on the bottom that are maintaining my altitude for me. But if I didn't have that, say if I didn't have thrusters on the front or something, this would let me control my pitch in order to maintain a specific altitude. Also in here, I've got maximum roll for banking turns. This will let me set a roll so that I can roll when I'm banking to turn. Let's set that to, say, 30 right here. And now this is going to, in total, let me bank when I need to turn more than 30 degrees, so it's going to start rolling, and then it's going to start using the pitch thrusters to try and turn me. Now the reason this is useful is on an airplane, you often using ailerons and tailplanes. Tailplanes can't exert a whole lot of force without getting absurdly large, compared to the number of ailerons that you can usually pack onto a wing pretty easily. So that, in some cases, can entirely negate the need for any yaw control at all on a vehicle, though generally you want to have at least a little bit just to be able to make those fine adjustments. So in this case, I have maximum roll for banking turns. This lets me define how steeply I want to turn. You can see I'm banking a little bit in the background. If I want to set this all the way up to, say, 90 degrees, and I want to say let's bank above 0 degrees, and yeah. So this will now bank all the way up to a 90-degree bank in order to execute tight turns. And that lets me execute a very tight turn without a lot of forward motion. It's quite useful, but as you can see here, it's very destabilizing. So you want to be careful about banking to turn. You want to try and limit that as much as possible to what you need. And if you can get away with using just yaw thrusters, sometimes that can be to your advantage. Alright, so we've also got a gradual roll increase over a certain angle. So you've got a minimum angle, you've got banking turns above a specific angle, and you've got gradual roll increase over an angle. So what this is going to do is above 30 degrees, let's set this to 40 so we have different numbers to work with, and this to 15. So what we're going to do here is above 30 degrees of turn, if we need to yaw more than 30 degrees, in other words, we're going to, over the next 40 degrees, so between the 30 and 70 degrees of yaw required, we're going to roll up to 15 degrees. And it's going to do that gradually. So if I'm at 30 degrees, I'm still at 0 roll. If I'm at, say, in this case 35, or rather this would be 50 degrees, if I'm 50 degrees yawed away from the target, I'm going to try and roll to 7.5 degrees banking, or roll, and then I'm going to try and execute that turn. So you've got a lot of control over exactly how your banked turns are done with this setup. It's very powerful and really great way of controlling airplane type vehicles. Now you've also got idle thrust here. What this is going to do is it's going to throttle back your thrusters when you're not actively fighting an enemy. A lot of aerial vehicles use a custom jet engine, and those things are fuel hogs. They will drain your fuel so fast it won't even know what hit it. So this lets you throttle those down so you're not burning nearly so much fuel out of combat, at the cost, of course, of traveling slightly slower. Now the idle circling distance, again, is when we're out of combat, and this will let us idle around the last waypoint that was set, and we'll just stick within this distance of that waypoint. That's it for airplane movement. Let's go on to the hover movement. So hover movement is what you'd expect out of a hovercraft. This can also be useful for like the point-at maneuvers and things like that. This is going to try and hover us at more or less a specific height based on our behavior. The behavior adjustments will define the height for you. And yaw lock distance is basically within 150 meters. We're going to not try and turn towards the target and thrust forwards towards it. We're just going to try and use our strafe and forwards back maneuvers to achieve that movement. So actually, if I enable hover movement here and I go back and I pick resource gathering, this is actually going to attempt to get to a certain altitude, and this should actually work out if my PIDs are tuned correctly, which it does not look like they are. Come on, we gotta maintain some altitude here. Yeah, so my PIDs weren't tuned particularly well to deal with that there, but they're that radical of an up-down maneuver. So more or less what this is going to do, this is going to fly me towards that nearest resource ring right over here. And once we get there, this maneuver is going to dictate that when I'm within 150 meters of that, then I'm not going to try and yaw to reach that target. Disabling forward or strafe above a specific azimuth means that if we're not pointing directly at where our behavior is dictating that we move to, then we are going to disable the forwards back and strafe movement axes. So that lets us say, I don't want to move forwards or sideways unless we're pointing fairly well towards where we want to go. However, we also have the options of pitching and rolling for forwards, back, and left-right movement. So in this case, or in the case of this specific vehicle, if I did not have any horizontal thrusters whatsoever, this maneuver would still let me be able to control the vehicle pretty well by that setting. So if I took all of those off, you'll note I have no way of pitching or rolling, or rather I can pitch and roll, but I have no forwards, back, or left-right movement control right now. I can kind of mimic those by giving myself just a little bit of pitch and roll control. And what this is going to do is it's going to try and pitch and roll so that my upwards thrust is going to bring me in the direction that I want to go. And you'll note that the strafe below distance is kicking in here because I'm actually strafing and going forwards backwards, not turning towards the target. So you can see I'm leveling out my pitch there because I'm within the ring. Starting to level out roll. PIDs aren't tuned quite properly for this slow of a maneuver, but yeah, that's more or less how this is going to work. So hover is really pretty versatile, and I like this a lot for any vehicle that's going to be flying low above the surface of the water, or the surface of the land, or surface of, well, anything really. Very good for hover tanks. The next movement to look at is the 6-axis, and this one is a little more complex. So this movement, or this maneuver, is going to assume that you have control over all 6 axes of movement on your vehicle. Right now I do not, so let's go ahead and fix that real quick just by setting all of these thrusters up real quick. And again, we do that by plopping these thrusters down. I'm right-clicking the things that are not enabled to make sure that they get enabled. And let's just go up here. We're going to do the same up here. And now we have thrusters in pretty much every direction. Let's go ahead and add forward or backwards thrusters. And just to demonstrate this a little bit better, I'm going to flip back to our bombing run AI. In fact, why don't we go ahead and throw on a point at rather than bombing run. So let's just go ahead and trash that, throw in a point at, and enable that. So 6-axis is trying to control all 6 axes of movement. And what this means is I'm going to very quickly try and use every thruster on this vehicle to execute this maneuver. Very often, specific maneuvers will only try and use specific thrusters and specific orientations of thrusters in order to achieve their desired target. So what that means is if I have, say, a backwards thruster on the vehicle, say these thrusters all the way up front here, and I'm trying to use those with a maneuver that is, say, an airplane maneuver, those are just never going to fire unless they're being used for yaw or the turner preset. They'll never be used in the pusher preset mode because I'm never going to try and reverse. Whereas with the 6-axis, that is definitely a possibility. Now, worth noting with the 6-axis, I need all 6 PIDs. That's pretty important to note. If I come from actually looking at the maneuver tab with this 6-axis maneuver, you can see what control modules I'm using over on the right here. That is actually constant with all of these, so if I pick airplane movement again, actually that does not appear to be the case there. So it looks like 6-axis is one of the main ones that does this, but a few of these have this control module usage where it tells you exactly what axes of movement they're going to try and control. So let's look at the settings in this. So we've got look ahead here. Now what this says is yaw and pitch can either be controlled by looking in the direction we've been told to look or in the direction we've been told to move. And the higher this value, the more we look in the direction we've been told to look. Wander distance is how far away from our waypoints we're going to allow ourselves to wander. And order complete distance is going to add a little bit of slop in there for, like if our behavior sets a specific maneuver waypoint, or we've set waypoints in the strategy menu, this will let us kind of get within a certain distance of that and say, okay, that's probably close enough, I don't need to worry about that, getting exactly to that point. This works better for 6-axis vehicles than, say, boat or naval movement, because our boat is probably going to be a lot more constrained in how it's moving, but getting a 6-axis movement vehicle to a very specific point in space, kind of a pain. So often this order complete distance is very useful in making sure that you're not trying to flutter around that one tiny little point in space and that you just move on to the next thing in your flight path. Last thing here is the use velocity instead of forward. So this is checked by default, and what this means is when we're looking forward towards our completion point, are we using our velocity to check where we are currently moving, or are we looking straight forward? So this is, again, fairly obtuse. Usually if I'm running a 6-axis controller, I will try turning this off first. This is generally a very hard to use type of controller. In a lot of cases where you want 6-axis, you're going to want to constrain what this is actually going to be able to control by doing things like taking the roll away from it by enabling a fake set point on a PID. So right here I just said, I don't care what the AI is telling you to do, I want 0 roll. Or I don't care what the controller is telling you to do, I want 0 pitch. So I'm always going to maintain 0 pitch and roll, and now the AI, sure, that can control the yaw, the altitude, the strafe, and the forward. I don't really care about those so much, but roll and pitch, this is going to do some weird things with them sometimes. So yeah, generally I try and stay away from 6-axis unless there's a very specific reason to use it. It also doesn't have the evasion routines, so generally speaking, 6-axis is something that I use only if I'm planning on applying more advanced behaviors, either through breadboarding or through ACBs or PIDs, that sort of thing. Next thing on the roster is the plane movement. And this is an airplane. And if I actually back out of there, you'll note that this is one of the few structures where I have plane and airplane. Those seem to be the same thing. Plane is the older from the depth style plane movement. I don't like this so much. There's really nothing that this can do that the other airplane movement can't do. So if you're going to pick one of these, pick airplane movement. This is the old style from the depths movement control, generally not very useful. Ship and tank, on the other hand, is useful. This is going to behave like a ship or a tank, and this basically lets us use the water type thrusters, the tank treads, all that sort of thing. It's going to try and use a pitch, and it's going to try and maintain a specific pitch. So if I turn this loose here, it's going to try and maintain a 15-degree pitch because that's what I've told it to do in that maneuver. And the naval AI doesn't so much care about your silly behaviors. It's going to try and maintain that 15-degree pitch, or rather it would if I had not set the fake set point on the PID controller. Yeah. If I turn that off, we've got a 15-degree pitch. So allow hover will allow you to use this for hovercraft. I think you're usually better off actually using a hover maneuver than trying to coerce a ship or tank maneuver to do this, but it's there if you want it, and it can sometimes be useful if you're trying to use, say, flotation devices, like if you're trying to use a hydrofoil with sticks pointing down into the water with hydrofoils on them. The hydrofoils will, enabling allow hover will basically let you use those hydrofoils to hover above the water a certain distance. Again, we've got wander distance, use velocity instead of forward, and order complete distance. All those apply as normal. These settings you're all pretty familiar with, and really that's all there is to it. Now, ship or tank, I believe, can also help control sails. That is the only thing that can control sails by default, though in the additional, you'll be able to set up an additional routine to help control sails as well. Last thing is the fortress maneuver. This tells the vehicle how to use fortress movement. We haven't really talked a lot about fortress movement, but if you take a look at the New Objects tab, of all things, it's in New Objects, not in any of the other control tabs. We have these Sky Fortress turbines. These basically turn power into a very limited form of movement that allows you to move very slowly while completely ignoring the laws of physics. Yeah, if you have these on your vehicle, and these can only operate on fortresses, you can move very slowly, you can keep your fortress in the air, but you're never going to move very quickly, and the laws of physics, for better and for worse, don't apply to you. You're never going to be able to do all those crazy evasion banking turns and all that sort of thing. It's just not going to happen, and you're probably better off just using the fortress maneuver and accepting that you're going to be very limited in what maneuvers and behaviors you can perform. So yeah, that's fortresses for you. But the fortress maneuver is basically going to tell you how to use those specific types of controls. And really, that's all there is to it. You can only have one of these active at a time, just like you can only have one of the behaviors active at a time. You can add however many of these you want. Generally, I don't like to add too many, but yeah. Let's just throw a hover on there so we have a stable vehicle, and yeah, that's pretty much that. The behaviors, adjustments, and maneuver encompass the vast majority of what you want to do with any given vehicle. Last thing we're going to look at here is the additional tab. And of the additional tab, again, you need slots for those. The additional routines, well, thruster balancing I don't find useful at all. I like to set up my thrusters manually, and I generally know what I'm doing better than this does, so I don't like thruster balancing at all. I never use that. Sailing lets you send control outputs to control sails in a specific way, so you can set up your sails manually on specific axes of movement. FTD sailing pretty much just does the same thing, but it controls the sails and spin blocks that sails are on automatically, and you don't have to worry about anything with it. So I would only use the regular sailing if I'm building a sailboat that's got a bunch of other spin blocks on it that I don't necessarily want being controlled as if they had sails. Yeah. Other than that, FTD sailing will control sails for you very nicely. FTD water start allows you to deploy balloons automatically when you hit the water, and it's going to deploy those balloons when you hit the water and cut them above a certain altitude. And projectile avoidance allows you to evade projectiles. Now, this is one of the most complex things in the AI configuration menu. So I'm going to go over some of these settings. The projectile avoidance UI, first of all, has a priority. Priority is important. So priority is telling us how to prioritize missiles. If I activate a couple of fake missiles for testing, I have a lateral distance above 100 meters on the first one, and let's say 440 on the second one. That means the first one is going to evaluate to a higher priority because the distance is lower on it, and the distance is higher on the second one, so that gets lower priority. These are just fake missiles for testing. This is acting as if I have a missile detected within a set distance, and you can change the parameters around on that. So the default priority I find is very useful. Sometimes you might want to have a hard cutoff on this, but overall, priority being 1 over distance is going to cover the vast majority of your use cases. You can also set a temporary variable to be calculated later. Now, in this case, if you want to do a bunch of really fancy math, what you could do here is find the altitude and the distance of the vehicle. You can determine whether the missile is actually coming towards you or not with a bit of tricky math. And, well, it doesn't really give you all the tools that you need to do that, but yeah, more or less, these are going to allow you to set a variable based on the priority of the missile, based on these calculations here. And all of these functions you can call here. So I could say I want to set A if, or rather that needs to be capitalized, so if distance is less than 100. Then I would output 1 on A, otherwise I would output 0. So this is outputting 0 because there's no missile within 100 distance on the A channel, and or a temporary variable. And if I have a missile that gets within, say, 50 or 100 meters, if I have under 100 meters, then, well, in theory that should give me a 1 output. Right now it's not. I'm not entirely sure why. Let's go down to 10. Yeah, okay. So that's not quite working the way I want it to, but okay. In any case, yeah, that's what these are for, is to set a temporary variable you can reuse elsewhere. Down here, we determine what we're going to do when there is a projectile within a specific distance. This is very, very useful. So in this case, let's say I want to suddenly hover up. I want to control my hover up or down based on if there's a missile. So in this case, I want to say there's a missile. Suddenly I'm thrusting upwards. Hey, now there's not a missile. I've returned control back to the AI. So if there's a missile, in this case within 100 distance, or 100 minus D, then I maneuver up or down. So in this action down here, another thing that we can do is output to these miscellaneous axes, and this is super useful. I'm going to set this to A here, and I've built a little warp controller down here. Haven't really talked about these. They're not really a primary movement mechanic. It's very hard to use these for actual normal movement. So what this is capable of doing, I've set this up with the A positive miscellaneous input. What I'm going to do here is go into the additional tab and output an A miscellaneous axis control request if I have a missile within a specific area. What this lets me do, then, if I have a missile that shows up, is warp. So if I have a missile within a set distance, I can have it warp me to the side. Now, how fast it's going to be able to do that is dependent on all sorts of factors relating to the construction of the warp controller, but what you can do is warp to the side when you have missiles that are too close. Very useful. I'm going to disable that so we're not warping all over the place. And that's pretty much the last of the additional routines. As I've said over here in basic settings, I don't like to use any of these except for the mainframe name, and we've already gone over the PIDs. So really that's all there is to the AI configuration. Hope you've enjoyed watching, hope you've learned something, and I hope you'll come back for the next tutorial, which should be on a very fun mechanic. We're going to take a look at tilt rotors. See you all next time, and have a good day.